also we thank you for your active participation. And I also want to welcome those who are with us in Barcelona but online, because as you know this is streamed live, and so we have a number of people following us from all over the world. So thanks for coming, thanks for being here online. Peter will continue.
Thank you. I would very much like to particularly welcome all of the speakers and chairs who are joining us. We do have speakers from all over the world. Some have travelled a very long way from California, from Canada, from Australia. So thank you, all of you who've put in the time, effort and energy to come and contribute to this debate. You all will have received a draft summary of the scientific output of the meeting. We're not going to actually discuss that during the meeting, but obviously we're going to refine and modify and revise that based on the discussions and the inputs that take place during the meeting. And if anybody has comments or wishes to add to that, please do so by email, or there's flip charts scattered around the room, so please just write a comment or something on that as we go through. But we won't actually kind of discuss it as a sort of discussion topic, but rather let it evolve from the comments that we receive through the discussion and from you. In this introductory session, we're going to introduce all of the speakers, and we're going to ask each of them a rather provocative question to really sort of start getting us to think about some of the issues that we will cover during the course of today and tomorrow. There are 3 speakers who've not yet arrived, but they have sent us recorded answers to their questions, so we will put them up on the screen. And unfortunately, one speaker, John Holmes, who was due to come, is ill and unable to travel. So although he has a question, we won't actually answer it. And someone will stand in tomorrow to give his presentation. So I'll hand back to Tony, who will start with the first round of questions.
Okay. In the first session we will have today, right after this introduction, the title is Why Worry About Addictions? And one of the speakers is Jürgen Rehm, coming from Canada, and he will talk about the harm of addiction, from addictions. And I would like to ask you, Jürgen, do you think when we talk about harm that we have paid enough attention to the harm to others?
It depends on the substance, is my answer. Basically, harm to others is... Okay, what I try to say is that harm to others and the attention paid depends on the subject. The substances are different. In the tobacco debate, harm to others is one of the major forces, and we have paid enough attention to it, with the result that basically this is one of the biggest success stories in public health, that the harm to others went down from 1990 to now. We did not pay enough attention on harm to others in alcohol and drugs, and that is something we are actually asked way more often by governments, but research has concentrated on harm to the user themselves.
Thank you, Jürgen. And the second presentation will be by Peter, who will talk about one of the key concepts of the Alice Wrap project, which is heavy use over time as a new concept. So, Peter, when we talk about this, you mean we need to get rid of the concept of addiction, of the concept of dependence?
This is a pretty radical view, but the answer is yes. I will argue that these are constructs that are simply consequences of heavy use over time. I would also like to say that there's actually kind of nothing really new in this argument. It is actually 30 years ago that I and a group of colleagues prepared a report for the UK's Royal College of General Practitioners on alcohol. And in that report, we said that we do not subscribe to the view that alcoholism is in itself a disease. Rather, we put forward the idea that people move along continua throughout their lives, continua of heavy drinking and continua of getting into problems from heavy drinking. And it's that movement in and out of the continua is something that we can help people in terms of moving into less risky drinking.
Thank you, Peter. And the third presentation in this first session will be from Dirk Lachenmeier from Dresden. And he has been the author or the main author of one of the most cited papers of Alice Rapp, which is the one on the margin of exposure. And probably one of the reasons is that when applying the margin of exposure methods, cannabis appears much better than alcohol. But can we trust this? Is it really true that cannabis has a much better margin of exposure than alcohol?
Yes, indeed, this has been the result of our study. If you talk about citations, what we mean is mentioning in the social media and not citations in the classical sense, and there we really had a tremendous success, if you may call it so, with the paper. Even if I think the public has somehow misunderstood the concept of the margin of exposure, we basically, as I will later show, make a risk assessment and not a safety assessment. But the public has suggested that cannabis is more safe than alcohol, but we are saying it the other way around, that alcohol has less, that cannabis has less risk than alcohol. But clearly, due to the major consumption of alcohol in the European Union, you know, exposure also is going inside this value of the margin of exposure, and due to the exposure alone, alcohol is at the top risk, clearly.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go on to session number 2 and start with Roger Sullivan. Roger, if you go to people who are still practice hunter-gathering in some parts of Africa, they're very heavy users of nicotine and of cannabis, and they appear to titrate their use against their intestinal worm burden. And indeed, if you treat people for their worm burden, people who were heavy smokers become less heavy smokers. Does this suggest that we're actually hardwired to use drugs?
I think it might do, yes. I mean, when you look at the interactions between animals and the plants that they eat in nature, when animals are interacting with plants that produce a lot of plant secondary metabolites or toxins, the behavior of the animal around the plant is quite predictable. And so one of the key things I'll be looking at in my talk is whether or not this is true for people too. You know, whether we can make predictions about human behavior as well.
Great, thank you. I'm moving over to the other side of the room to Robert Dudley. Robert, we humans evolved as fruit eaters, and the sugar in ripe fruit ferments to alcohol, presumably as a way of kind of protecting the fruit from rotting. And we seem to like this fermentation process. In the same way, are we hardwired to seek out alcohol?
I think the answer is absolutely yes for all primates that are fruit eaters, and that includes basically most primates. We are hardwired. Did anybody go out to a restaurant last night or a tapas bar and drink alcohol? You did not drink acetic acid or vinegar, and I think there's a good reason for that, that alcohol only derives obligately from the fermentation of carbohydrate. So primates, and ourselves included, with the exception of some East Asian polymorphisms, basically will seek out alcohol because we associate it psychoactively with nutritional reward in a relationship that goes back tens of millions of years.
Thank you. I'm coming back over here to Lara Schmidt. Lara, I'm using one of the words in your presentation. You seem to be slouching towards putting sugar in the same kind of bucket as alcohol and as other drugs. What would make you make that final jump to look at sugar in the same kind of way as alcohol?
Actually, what I'm slouching towards is what I call a pan-addiction model.
Okay.
I'm interested in the ways we think about addictive substances are changing over the course of the globalization of markets, free market ideologies that fail to rein in corporations that strive to produce products that are habit-forming, and to secure markets that way. And sugar provides a wonderful example of those processes, those big global processes at play.
Thank you. Thank you. The third session has a name, an interesting name, Addiction, a Chameleon Concept. And we will have again 3 presentations. Alex will be presenting on the history of addiction concepts. And I would like to ask you, we will say history teaches us, but when looking back, which is the most important lesson from the past we have ignored?
I think one of the key lessons is that too often we forget the history, and that though the past doesn't repeat itself exactly, we need to understand the ways in which the past has influenced the present. So addiction concepts have changed over time and place, but by better understanding what's driving those changes, we can better understand addiction today.
Thank you. And in the same session, Raquel will talk about the stakeholders, and that's what you've been studying. And there's been a lot of controversy, especially in fields like tobacco and alcohol. So my question would be, can stakeholders really work together to promote the public good?
I think the work conducted in Work Package 2 indicates that, that within the drugs field, it is possible for a broad range of stakeholders to work together, accommodate differences, and develop policies and approaches to reduce the harms associated with drug use. However, within our work and within the alcohol, we found that there is an increasing stakeholder animosity, which acts as a barrier to collaboration and leads to entrenched views, which may not always result in constructive public health policies.
Thank you. The last presentation will come from Finland, from Helsinki. Matilda Hellman will be presenting and on the conceptualization of addictions. And my question to you is, there are differences. Professional and popular narratives of addictions are clearly different, but who's got it right?
I think maybe nobody has it right, because everybody's worldviews on the problems, of course, differ according to the function their views have and what they want to accomplish with that. But what I want to emphasize in my presentation would be that it's important to know the patterns in which these kind of diverse perceptions of the problems, how they pattern in societies and between societies.
Thank you. The next session we're going on to is looking at market forces and how this impacts our use of alcohol and drugs. And I start off with you, Jan. You've shown that advertising impacts our brains. Does advertising take away our freedom of choice?
Yeah, that's a good question, Peter. I don't think it takes away your freedom of choice. There is always a choice to drink or not to drink, or to use a drug or not to use a drug. But it's also evident that when exposed to advertising of drug use or alcohol use, that there is a brain response to it. And that brain response basically says, yes, I like to go for it. And this is the knowledge, I think, that we should be very much aware of when producing commercials for alcohol or even for drugs, medicinal drugs or drugs of abuse.
Thank you. My next question is to Martine, who's not here, but she will give her answer up on the screen. And my question is to Martine is that given that we are active and functional in relation to the drugs that we take, it's no wonder that exposure in terms of marketing impacts our behavior. And my question to Martine is, can we reduce that exposure when it is digitally all around us?
Yes, of course we can reduce exposure. Look at the EU Tobacco Advertising Directive, which has banned all forms of tobacco advertising and sponsorship, including on the internet. Some countries have gone further and banned tobacco displays at points of sale and branded packaging, or restricted sales to government-regulated outlets. Why can't we do the same for alcohol and gambling marketing?
Okay, thank you. I was going to have a question for David Miller, but unfortunately he's delayed in his travels, so he is not here yet, so I won't ask him the question. And then I was going to have a question in the next session when we're looking at determinants and pathways, a question for John Holmes, who, as I said, unfortunately is ill and is unable to travel, so I'll miss that question. So I'll then come on to a question for Anne McNeil, who also is not here, but she will give, again, her answer on the screen. And my question to Anne went that it is obvious to me that electronic cigarettes are much safer than smoked cigarettes. But as with many things, this obviousness, when it's been published, has created a major furore with very different opinions. And I'm asking Anne, is the tobacco control movement falling into the trap of prohibition?
However, there is no consensus on this, and in some countries, we have always steered clear of discussing prohibition in the tobacco control movement, but in my view, the emergence of effective and popular alternative nicotine delivery mechanisms means that combustible tobacco could become obsolete. However, there is no consensus on this, and in some countries, these alternative systems are prohibited, contributing to a confusing rhetoric about the role of nicotine in the mortality and morbidity wreaked by tobacco use and what our end goals actually are.
Okay, thank you. My next question is to Patricia. And Patricia, in our transition to adulthood, we have a more flexible engagement of our executive control brain centers than when we are adult. Some people have argued that that has an evolutionary advantage because it enables adolescents to sort of push and challenge human frontiers, but it also has consequences for our drug use. So how do we actually balance young people's propensity to seek out drugs with their impulsivity?
I think the answer is in the fact that risk-taking can come in many shapes and forms, and that there are ways in which you can encourage young people to take risks and push the boundaries when it doesn't necessarily involve drugs. So they can be encouraged to, explore other types of activities that they actually see as being helpful and more in line with their long-term goals or their current goals, and young people can actually be motivated to make wiser choices for themselves through promoting skills and better kind of norms and social norms. So,
thank you. And the sixth session will deal on prevention and treatment, and the first to speak will be Robin Room, halfway from Australia and Sweden, and he will speak about stigma and treatment. To me, this looks like the chicken and egg dilemma. Should we combat stigma in order to decrease the treatment gap, or should we increase the treatment offer as a way to combat the stigma?
The problem with stigma is that if you look at it from the point of view of, say, the mental health literature, then it's something that somehow drops from the clouds and is very bad, and that we should be combating. If you look at it from the point of view of legislators passing laws, they're always passing laws that say that this is illegal, and that's a way of essentially stigmatizing it. So that fundamentally our societies operate with a sense of sort of moral order. When we get to the kind of substances that we're talking about with us, and behaviors, then we're dealing with things where, as we've already talked about, there's a very strong commercial market, and the commercial market isn't all in favor of moralizing the behavior, putting the responsibility on the individual, not on the fact that there's a context in which that individual is making their choices that is being controlled, among other things, by the commercial market. So that from that point of view, we need to be thinking about what kind of moralization do we want around these substances? And that goes to the question then of where does the treatment system fit into that? And to what, it's very clear that it's often one of the main reasons that people don't come to treatment is because they'll then be identified as someone who is somehow morally deficient, essentially. And anyone who's running a treatment system, a treatment agency, knows very well that that has to be faced if we're going to be successful in the treatment.
Thank you. Another participant in this session has not arrived yet. She is Anne Linford-Hughes, but she has given us sent us the answer to the question. She's been working in the reward system. So my question to her was, is it all about dopamine? And let's listen to her answer. Oops.
So is it all about dopamine? No. Whilst the dopaminergic mesolimbic pathway has been shown to be involved in many facets of addiction, such as drug liking, drug seeking, attention, learning, impulsivity and motivation, the level of critical involvement appears to vary for different substances of abuse. Thus, there is currently no widely used, clinically effective medication for treatment of addiction that directly targets the dopamine system. Understanding how the opioid and GABA systems modulate the mesolimbic dopaminergic system has, however, delivered a variety of effective treatments for a range of substances of abuse.
Okay. Thank you. And from treatment to prevention, there is a last presentation from Fabrizio Fabiano. The title is Towards a European Prevention Agency. So, Fabrizio, I would say, one more agency? Do you really have good reasons to create a prevention agency?
Yes. The problem is that everybody agree about the essential role of prevention in substance use management. But in fact, in Europe, we don't have any framework. We don't have any set of guidelines, any specific policy on prevention. And every state, every member have their own strategy for prevention. And usually these strategies are not very, very scientific based. So I don't know if the solution is a new agency, but I think that we need a solution. We need an idea in order to discuss and to define how to solve this problem.
Okay, thank you. We're coming on to the last session, which is around governance, and this is a question for Tony. A well-being frame helps us to identify the co-benefits and the adverse consequences of our drug policies. Do you see this frame as a tipping point towards a more rational drug policy?
The short answer should be yes. And the answer a bit longer should be that yes, if we get the well-being frame accepted by the wide majority of citizens, and not only for the addiction problem. I think there's a big movement coming from at least 20 years. The OECD has been investing a lot of efforts on that. And if we get the society to buy in the well-being concept, then certainly in the addictions field, we will be able to frame the addictions in a much better way than we have been doing up till now. And it's going to be at a tipping point.
Okay, thank you. I'm coming now on to Tomiko. Tomiko, it is argued that whole-of-society approaches are needed to deal with the so-called wicked problems of which drugs are one. When I was at WHO, I worked with a range of tobacco control colleagues, two of whom now, because of electronic cigarettes, work with the tobacco industry. Should we be talking with them?
Provocative question again. I think that public decision-making should be based not on outputs, not on products or delivery mechanisms. We should base our decisions on outcomes, on impacts. And here dialogue is key to have more information on new devices, have better informed decision-making, have a convincing dialogue also with the industry. And we have to take into account this balance in between well-being and individual choices. So at the end, dialogue should be there, but the public decision-making should take the lead on the final decisions and not get co-opted by the industry in those decisions where well-being is key.
Thank you. And the last presentation will be by Peter, and in one of the key concepts we have been developing in Alice Wrap, which is the addiction footprint, the health footprint. So the question for Peter is very simple. Should we expect that shortly the labels of wine bottles should include their health footprint?
Yes. I mean, there's evidence that shows if you label food products with their carbon footprint, that does actually influence purchasing choices. So I think one could argue that labeling wine bottles and other alcohol beverages with their health footprint is one more bit of information in terms of increasing consumer awareness that may or may not help consumer choices in what they purchase.
Thank you. And with this, we hope we have given you a small taste of what's going to be during those 2 days. And as we said in the beginning, this is the Alice Wrap debate, and we do want a big debate, so we expect from all of you a very active participation so that we can discuss and challenge the concepts that will be presented. Thank you very much.